Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Venu Gupta. I am the executive director of the Chicago Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. For those of you that are um, new to the organization, or this is your first Civil Rights Right Now conversation, the Chicago Lawyers Committee is a civil rights and economic justice organization that was founded in 1969. We use community lawyering to advance the the civil rights of communities and neighborhoods, and try to provide legal advocacy from litigation to policy to support as a tool. And we're thrilled to have you with us. This is a Civil Rights Right Now is a conversation series that we started several months ago where we talk to folks who are thought leaders and impact leaders in the space of civil rights and economic justice. Welcome. Thank you for taking time the day before a holiday. We know that talking about economic instability is not the way that folks want to start their day, their long weekend, but we appreciate it in great part because we are going to have to be the ones that turn this around for all of us. We're very lucky to have with us a dear friend of mine and expert, Tonantzin Carmona. Um, she and I met in 2019. She just reminded me, but feels much longer. Hi, Tonantzin. Welcome.
Hi, it's good to be here.
Um, Tonantzin was a rock star then. She is a rock star now. She is a fellow at Brookings Metro. I do not know the difference between Brookings Metro and Brookings, the Brookings Institute. For those of you that don't know about the Brookings Institute, it is a think tank, which means they bring together a lot of folks to think about and research different things related to policy. Tonantzin can tell us more. Tonantzin has also worked for the Biden administration. She was also has also been involved politically. So just we're very lucky to have her. We're going to dive into kind of what it is that she works on. As you probably noticed, that today is about economic stability and civil rights. And we as a country don't often think about those things together, but we don't think about them together enough. For those of you that know Dr. King's writings, you'll know that towards the end of his leading the civil rights movement, right, he started to say that we both need access to the ballot box and economic viability for people of color, for African Americans, right? That those two things had to go hand in hand. And I feel like Tonantzin, you are really digging into the kind of what people would call his more radical message towards the end, which is that folks have to have the ability to have and accumulate enough wealth to live a life where they can pursue happiness. Would you just start off telling us a little bit about your work?
Sure, I'm happy to. Well, first of all, I'm like looking at the chat, and it's so great to see that so many amazing people have joined. I miss you all. I miss Chicago so much. But yeah, I started my career in Chicago local government. I started as a generalist in public policy and have really prided myself in that my approach to policy is you have to hear directly from people, their lived experience, and build policy together every step of the way. And I think that the strongest policies always keep that in mind. And I have certainly approached my work since local government in the same way. And it's a lot harder to do in federal. I worked at Treasury and at the White House, but wherever possible, it's always about making sure that we can bring people to the table to basically have a say in their own livelihoods and the types of policies that they need to thrive. And so in my research, I focus a lot on wealth and inequality, a bit on financial and emerging technologies, and some on state and local policy. But the reason that I focus on wealth in particular is because wealth, unlike income, is incredibly important both for economic security, but also economic mobility. And for a lot of communities, especially Black and Latino communities that have been historically excluded from these, wealth is what will enable them and future generations to not just survive, but also thrive. And so my approach very much still takes that same lens where it's we bring folks their lived experience to the table to not just analyze what the perhaps inequities are, but also what are the potential solutions at various levels of government.
And you said something that resonates so deeply with the work we do, which is that you believe that policy needs to be developed by, informed by the folks who are impacted. And I want to get into that, and we will. I also just want to shout out that you grew up in Chicago. I know you're in DC now, but Chicago is lucky to have you. So I was telling Tonantzin before we started, I was like, "Do you want to talk about the 250th? I actually don't care that much." And and I feel really ambivalent about it. Um, and I was thinking about why. And for those of you that have seen Bridget Jones's Diary, I don't know if you'll remember this, but on her 32nd birthday, like her life was sort of trash and she had to turn it around. And so I don't know that it was a birthday to be celebrated as much as it was a birthday to be like, things aren't going that well. And I need to look in the mirror and turn things around. How are you feeling about, especially being in DC, all of this? I don't know what it means to be 250 years old as a country. And I'll just, there's a lot of feelings about that too. But what are your thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a tough question because I think what you're describing too is that we're essentially living in a very challenging moment. And when I think about anniversaries, you tend to think of more the positive and the celebration. But I think anniversaries are also an important moment for reflection. So I think I am leaning more into thinking of this anniversary as a point of reflection. The the promise of the American experiment has for many been about how do we ensure that every generation has the opportunity to fully participate in our democracy and our economy. There have been a subset of people who have fought and really pushed for those types of things. And so I'm using this moment not just to think about the historical arc and the progress that has been made, even when you have moments of pushback, there has been progress. But I'm also thinking about then what do I want the next 250 years to look like for future generations? And so, yeah, it is a time to really like lean into reflecting on everything, history, but also the challenges, and then thinking through how do I want to make sure I play a role as a citizen of the United States to truly expand opportunity, participation, freedom for the next generation. And whether I do that in my small day-to-day actions or through my work or through policy or through hopefully, serving in another administration, I want to make sure that the next generation inherits a better portion of the American experiment.
Yeah. So because we're friends, I'm going to dive a little deeper, which is at what point do you say we need a new, like the experiment failed?
Yeah.
We need, we need a new pathway, and specifically with your lens on creating, on what we need to do to create wealth for Black and brown communities.
It's hard because I don't know. I think a huge element of it has failed. And then I will say, even in these moments of darkness, like I think of like Chicago and like let's just take the example of like immigration enforcement and the way that we felt that and lived that so viscerally, so much darkness. And then the way that regular people continue to show up for their neighbors still tells me that there are elements of this experiment that do work. And how do we then hold on to that type of patriotism? So, not just celebrating history and saying, like, rah, rah, these good things happen, but it's like, no, there are parts of society that can say, maybe I don't have your experience, and yet I'm still going to stand up with you and for you in this process. And so I think, you take that and you put it in specific spaces like economic policy. I actually feel like part of the issue right now is that we have segments of both parties that either don't have solutions or aren't presenting an affirmative vision. And then when you do have people that do, we almost think, oh my gosh, those ideas are too outlandish and too wild. But I think what people are telling us is that clearly the status quo is not working. And
Yeah.
so we must think bolder and we must fight for bolder solutions. And if we can do that together towards economic opportunity, I actually think we could even solve for much of right now what has led us to this current moment that people are very upset with their livelihoods, the status quo. It's the very tangible material things, but you can solve for so many things if we can tackle the economic portion first.
That that's I can buy that. I can live with that. um, okay, so now kind of circling back to this idea that, right, you, as we mentioned, you grew up in Chicago, you've had these tremendous national experiences. You have also talked about people who are impacted by the policies that are designed should be informing the next iteration of policies. What do you see missing from the national conversation?
Yeah, I feel like I alluded to a little bit of this in that, I think we're very good at talking about communities, talking to communities, but we're not as good at listening to them. And growing up in Little Village and Pilsen, I think one of the biggest lessons of those neighborhoods is that people don't experience public policy as a whole, or like not as separate issues. They experience it as a whole. They don't separate housing from childcare, immigration from small business, transportation from jobs. They experience all those things at once because that's how life works. And over the last several years, people have been telling us that they're frustrated with the economy, not because some economic indicator said we were here or there. They just have felt that things have become increasingly unaffordable and uncertain. And those policies reshaped our politics today. They are how we got to where we are right now because people were responding to this unease and unhappiness with the status quo. Whether the solution was what we have now, the right one, I would say no, and you would probably say no, but it is how we got to where we are. And so now the question would be, do we have leaders that are actually responding to what people are telling us, in this national conversation? And I worry we're still debating too many policies in like silos, and we need to create more like of a full comprehensive agenda of like what would it actually take to have working families and communities thrive. So not just survive. I don't want just, like I want to actually thrive, and I want to know my family, the next generation has opportunity. And I think that's part of what we've lost over the last few years. And so while we do have some leaders that are embracing language of, say, affordability, and that is an important shift. Affordability alone isn't enough. We also need a compelling vision for economic opportunity, one that helps people build wealth, to start businesses, to own homes, to raise families, and to set out that next generation. And what I have found, whether it was at City Hall, Treasury, or the White House, the strongest policies always start by listening first and then making sure that the people closest to the problems, closest to the pain, actually have a say in dictating their future. And so what's missing, I think we're hearing little pieces of it that people are trying to listen. We're hearing affordability, but to feel like we actually have heard, I think then you have actual tangible quality responses to that pain.
Can you give me an example of where you felt like that worked well? What is a policy that you feel like folks listen to, folks who are impacted and changed? Yeah, and I'll give you the whole of American history. You can choose any example.
Okay, so we've have had in American history periods of incredible wealth inequality. You think about the Great Depression. We had the oligarchy that had essentially like taken over during the Gilded Age. So much power, so much wealth, all concentrated amongst a few hands, kind of similar to what we're experiencing now. And then we had the Great Depression that collapsed. And so all of a sudden, you have a response from the government through the New Deal policies that led to things like Social Security, that led to things like policies to enable people to build homes, to start businesses, et cetera. It started to like level the playing field. Now, whole swaths of the population in the United States were excluded from that. Black communities in particular were not afforded those same opportunities. But we saw that those policies were responsive and ended up creating an entire middle class in the United States, a white middle class that then was able to build wealth and pass that on over generations. So it can work. And I would say that what we would need is kind of like a new deal. We could call it a true deal, whatever. But this same idea in a more inclusive manner that actually helps people advance, not just themselves, but their families and future generations. And their whole package, that whole deal, new deal package of labor protections, like ensuring we were building worker power, which is super important, that we were, again, allowing that wealth building. It was a whole package, but it really did change whole trajectories of an entire class of people in the United States.
Um, so before I respond to that, I think it's really interesting for folks who want to ask questions. We will have time for questions, like 15 or 20 minutes, probably 15. If you go to your Zoom page and you see the more button, you can click on it and put a question in the chat, and we'll get to it towards the end. You can also put a question in the chat in the um, Zoom chat, and we'll also see it there. So what I really appreciate about what you're saying is I feel like you're building for what comes next after this authoritarian
Yeah.
regime, right? And so that I really appreciate because I think we're we are trying to straddle both protecting and defending and envisioning what comes next, but doing both is really hard.
Yeah.
It's like being a grief doula and a birth doula are very hard to do at the
Yeah.
same time, you know? And so, what I appreciate is you're not boxed in by, like, just the realities of today, where accountability is I has all been but dismantled, in many ways by the executive branch, but you're like, "Okay, however whatever comes next, we have to make sure we're thinking about what it looks like to have accountability to folks who are impacted." Okay, so with that, my question for you is, right, civil rights and economic security, as I mentioned in the beginning, are often treated as separate conversations. Your work, the writing that you do, I think treats them as one in the way that they should be treated, right? There are many folks here who are lawyers and advocates, who primarily think of civil rights like as voting, housing, and the courts. What is it about the economic story that also belongs at the center of the civil rights agenda?
Yeah, so I also kind of just want to comment a little bit about what you were saying before this question. And I think a lot of us are going to play different roles in this moment. And so I personally like I think that's why I don't want to be boxed in, but I also love history. And I have been very inspired by the civil rights movement. I mean, if you think about what the Jim Crow South was, it was authoritarianism.
Absolutely.
And people still organized and maintained faith. And you had the builders and the defenders and the protectors, but you also had folks that were trying to envision and push us to light and to, that light at the end of the tunnel. And so I think that's kind of why I'm like, there are days when I just, sit in my feelings and feel everything that I need to. And I'm depressed and I'm like, okay, how do we protect, defend? But then there are, I think, days like this where I'm like, okay, I think my role right now, at least in my job and what I get to do, because I get to put forth policy ideas, is I also want to envision a better future. And not to say everybody has to play every role at once or in different phases, but like at least that's the path that I have chosen. And it is very much inspired by the lessons of the past and the organizers in the past. And I would say, then to your question is that, it does seem that oftentimes in discussions we have separated, civil rights and economic policy, but historically too, and you kind of said this up front with Martin Luther King, they've also been very connected because civil rights has also been about expanding who gets to fully participate in American life. And we
Yeah.
often think about participation politically, the right to vote, legally, equal protection, educationally, equal access to schools. But participation is also economic. Do you
Yeah.
have access to a quality job, a safe job, that one that'll enable you to like support your family? Can you access capital? Can you access contracts? Can you build wealth? And then can you pass it on to the next generation? That also is about participating fully in American life. And so I would say, one of the things I think about with economics is whether or quietly narrow it. And
Mm,
I think that there have been administrations, at least at the federal government and even Congress, that have tried to like advance laws and policies that help expand that participation. But right now, at least in my work, I'm actually just trying to document the various ways that the federal government is trying to narrow that access to opportunity. And one segment of it has been focused on entrepreneurs, because I do think that that's a space where for the most part, you can actually find bipartisan support to support small businesses. And so I'm like, if we're not going to find it anywhere else, like this is one area to channel it. But then two, you can see the very clear ways in which federal policy has moved to try to expand access to those wealth building avenues. And so I would say that the economy is just one way in which civil rights can become tangible. Having the right to start a business means very little if institutions that provide capital contracts or technical assistance and market access are disappearing. And so that's right now what a lot of my research is just capturing the various levers and how they're changing.
thank you. Super helpful and makes so much sense. So what are you finding? And would love for you to kind of really be specific. What you say you're documenting the ways in which, and I know you are, I mean, you are writing prolifically about the ways in which entrepreneurs, small businesses, especially people, small businesses run by people of color, um, are being harmed deeply in this
Mhm.
administration. I would love for you to talk about some of the specific programs. Um, yeah, please. What are you finding?
So there's a few areas. So I will say one subset of my work initially just started at looking at Latino entrepreneurs. And I was very fortunate that I had the space to basically interview small businesses, the local chambers and the ecosystem that supports these businesses and just ask them, what are the things that you're worried about right now? What are the challenges? How are you experiencing them? And in that, people started identifying a few common themes. And one was the changes in tariff policy, that tariff volatility was really inhibiting their ability to plan, to hire, to expand, et cetera, because they never knew what the policy was going to be one day to the next. And the second one, and I think this is the one that most Chicagoans saw and felt most viscerally, was the impact of immigration enforcement, either on the businesses themselves or their business corridors. And so
Yep.
it's like business corridors like Little Village, 26th Street, which I grew up walking every single day. Restaurants were seeing fewer customers because families were afraid to go out, or even workers weren't showing up. And so restaurants are trying to determine, do we hire, do we not? And then that also impacts local suppliers who then get impacted because of a business. And maybe a business owner postpones taking out a loan or deciding not to expand. There's all these economic implications beyond obviously what families and communities are experiencing viscerally on other political, social health elements. But the economic impact was that you can take a business, but there's a whole ripple effect for the local economy in terms of what was happening. And this was very much something that I started to track, not just in certain parts of the country, but all over, because of what these business owners were sharing months before the media even kind of like spotlighted it. So by the time my work got published, it was already like, oh my gosh, it kind of like met the moment because now reporters were starting to see, at least at the national level, hey, immigration, we always typically cover it in terms of workers, which is important, and labor, but there's whole ecosystems that are getting impacted right now. And again, that came because of those voices that express that in interviews. The third element that they express, and this is kind of like the second subset of my work, was that there were also a lot of changes to federal policies that support small businesses. And so that's what I've also been documenting, the way in which like either lending contracts, or I would say capital contracts and technical assistance for small businesses have all been altered, and specifically those that support minority owned businesses.
Yeah.
With lending, they're trying to tighten the rules. They're trying to exclude certain communities, including green card holders, from accessing certain lending options. With the certain programs like the 8A program, which is supposed to support minority entrepreneurs in getting access to contracting, either through specific opportunities or through technical assistance, they're completely shifting the rules such that being a minority owned business no longer qualifies you as disadvantaged, because that was the technical term. And so all of a sudden they're shifting the language. And so we go from, in a single year, maybe 2,100 businesses qualified for this program. And now, because they don't like DEI or anything that will support small businesses, they view that as racist or wrong. Now maybe 60 can pass the same like litmus test. And so you're starting to see that all of these programs that actually were developed, like 8A, for example, was developed post civil rights by a congressman in the Black Caucus who was like, we need to expand access to capital. They're targeting those and rolling those back. And so a lot of my work is just documenting the way capital contracts and technical assistance are changing at the federal level.
Um, and it sounds like it sounds like it's incredibly significant. I'm having so many reactions to what you're saying. The first is that I think there's often this narrative around immigration that focuses on undocumented people
Mhm.
that is also false, which is that somehow, and I've heard this in rooms, and I find it appalling, but I think it is the case that somehow the way to sell the idea of immigration is that immigrants make America affordable. Um, and the other side of the conversation never gets brought up, which actually is that immigrants make America wealthy.
Yeah. Yeah, they do. They contribute so much to our economy as workers, as entrepreneurs, as builders, as community members. I'm like, when your neighbor disappears from one day to the next, you notice because you're like, oh, that person was super involved in my community doing XYZ, or they own this business, or they always were just looking out for us, making sure we were safe. I mean, they are embedded in our communities. And I think that's why Chicagoans felt so strongly. I mean, folks from all across the country, like I think Minnesota was such a great example. Like people were showing up for their neighbors because they're one of us and so I think that shifting the narratives is important. I actually always have to tread this interesting line because I want to track the economic impact, and it's not because I believe people's values derives from their economic
Yeah,
impact
that's
as
what I was.
much as I'm like, no, everyone deserves, equal opportunity. This is one example of it. But then also when I'm talking to policymakers who maybe don't see the moral, the human lens to it, I'm like, fine, I'm going to show you the data. Here you go. And so like it's just another avenue to try to meet people where they're at.
Same. I'm really glad that right? I think there is this line of like, it's not people don't derive their value from their
No.
productivity, and for people who are focusing on a different measure or don't, right? It is a way to meet people where they're at. Um, the other thing I want to say, and then I do want to talk about DEI, but that, right, you said that they, I think we all know who they is, don't like DEI. What I would just put a finer point on that and say that DEI, it's not that they don't like it, it's that it threatens their white nationalist agenda,
Hmm.
right? It isn't about liking or not liking, it's about DEI is a threat to maintaining power.
Yeah.
And so just like I feel like for my own
Mm.
um
Put the finer point.
yeah, exactly. All right.
I'm
So
there with you.
let's talk about DEI. Um so the administration has been trying to quietly put up regulation after regulation, right? Propose regulation after regulation to make it impossible to get federal funding if an entity does anything related to um, anything that is designated around race that's non-white, right?
Hmm.
So in the spring, the administration moved to bar federal contractors from what it calls racially discriminatory DEI activities, um, which meant that it reached vendor and supplier decisions, and made compliance material to getting paid. Right, so they're putting a lot of effort into making
Hmm.
sure that entities that they fund do not engage in any kind of talent development um, around people of color. Um, and then, right, the what happens, as you know, is that it's suppliers aren't going to fight. They just quietly wind down what they were doing rather than risking the dollars, the lawsuits. And your research specifically focuses on access to contracts as a wealth building channel for businesses owned by people of color. What downstream consequences are you already seeing? Um, and do you feel like the public is paying enough attention to it?
I'd say to the point on like paying attention, some folks are, but I will say there's so much happening that I don't blame people if they're not paying attention to this element. I will say there's certainly organizations and people that do. Part of my job in documenting this is like one, I kind of just want to keep track of everything that's happening. Um, but then two, I think it's helping me then think through how to better use the levers of government. Because I will say, I think if there's anything that's come from this, it's like there's so many lessons in the power of government that I have learned. And it is power that is being used for awful purposes. But can we then learn from those levers and use them for good? I don't, there's just so much creativity that's actually been done in terms of how they use rules, how they use a specific program, incentives, the law. And I think that is what I'm thinking about when I'm considering more affirmative visions. And I guess what I would say with, what's happening with contracting and suppliers, it's like, one, even prior to this, I'm not necessarily certain if a lot of these programs, like I would say the status quo of these programs are even working in terms of like already providing equal opportunity to people. But at the same time, the markets were not necessarily providing automatically that equal opportunity. So a lot of these programs, institutions emerged to kind of fill those gaps. Community lenders play an important role, SBA programs play an important role, technical assistance, procurement offices, business incubators, minority business organizations. Like they came in because the market was not necessarily fair. And what we're seeing right now is that those institutions are being weakened. It doesn't mean that opportunity disappears overnight, but it does gradually narrow that opportunity. And so I would say that the downstream effect is that obviously, like, if a supplier, gets impacted, then the business that they work with gets impacted, the worker that gets hired by either that whole chain of businesses gets impacted, and so on. And so we will ultimately feel those impacts, but because it's gradual, it's like harder for us to really document like in the moment. We kind of just like feel it. You kind of notice when people are like, oh, the market's a little slower, or like it's hard to find a job. You hear it in the subtle ways. The data will probably appear within the next like year or two. But what I would say then is, because the federal government is doing this role of like narrowing, it also does mean that perhaps cities and states can play a role. And, they're not going to be able to replace every federal dollar, but they can preserve the infrastructure of opportunity. They can strengthen procurement. They can expand those state capital programs. They can invest in CDFIs and minority depository institutions. They can speed payments to small businesses or provide technical assistance, and even nonprofits and philanthropy can step in and try to like create opportunities. And a lot of my policy solutions in like one of my first reports on this kind of like spoke to that. You do see examples of, say, like places like Los Angeles, where they're like, we're going to use our government authority to respond to this moment with the drastic immigration enforcement. You actually saw it in places like North Carolina, and like little spots there where they were like, we're going to also provide grant dollars to our small businesses, et cetera. And so there are pockets of either civic infrastructure or city and state leaders that are coming in to step in for these gaps that are being created. Um, but it's going to be a lot of work. And so I think it's like, this is going to be that work of the protection. And then there's going to be some of us that are like, okay, then how do we use those federal levers for good?
Yeah. Um, I love that you're always thinking about like where where the silver lining is. It's
I don't
very
know, it's like to
it's
a
good.
fault. I
It's
don't
good.
know.
It's
Little
good.
Delulu, I don't know, but it keeps me
No, I
working.
like it. I like it. So the question I want to ask is like, okay, so what's the number? How much like, and you may not have it, and I didn't prep you for this question, so I no worries if you don't. But like, how much money do you think this narrowing is going to cost the United States?
That I do not have. Because I'm like, there's so many segments that are being impacted. I'm like,
Mm,
you can track workers. There's already some like studies that are trying to track like the impact of just immigration enforcement. Then there's businesses, small, medium, and large. And I think why it's hard to document is because obviously there's different sectors, individuals, and industries that get impacted, but there's also been so many policy shifts. And that's why I talk about it in terms of policy volatility, because it's not just immigration enforcement, it's also tariffs. And now we have these wars that are leading to gas prices. And like there's all of these things that are happening at once that A, it's hard to track all of us. And then like B, it's hard to measure the impact and to say if it's one thing or another. So I kind of just put it all in this bucket of like policy shifts, and just the fact that it's shifting and we can't quite follow is leading to detrimental impacts. Whether our economic indicators track them or not, I think it's kind of like a separate issue, because even within the Biden administration, and I worked at the National Economic Council, and I saw firsthand the way that the arguments are being made that, well, the economy is doing well because look at these economic indicators. And we're kind of hearing the same thing right now. And I'm like, that is very distinct from what people are expressing that they're feeling on the ground. And so I do think there's like separate work that needs to be done to even change the way that we have our economic indicators tell us whether our economy is doing well, because it doesn't seem to be tied to people's experiences. But in terms of the number, I don't have it now, but I'll get one for you in the next few months.
and that's not on you. That's on me. It was I didn't tell you I was going to ask. Um, I and that is another thing that's been coming up for me as you've been talking. Like the S&P is right. Like, don't even get me started. But whatever. Like the S&P, if we're not bombing Iran, it's like goes sky high, and
Yeah.
then you go to Costco, and I and I'm going to be really transparent. Like, I have a lot of economic privilege and I'm very, very lucky. And I go to Costco and I'm like,
Yeah,
what the F? Like, this is crazy, right? So it feels so disconnected.
absolutely. Absolutely. And I know that there are some think tanks and researchers that are trying to sort out what are better indicators, but for sure what we have now is not meeting people where they're at. It's not meeting the moment.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'm gonna start asking some questions. I see that there's only one question in this little Q&A box. I'm assuming you're all typing them now, but please, this is such an opportunity to talk to someone who who has seen so many different pieces of what it looks like to try to build economic thriving for communities of color, and would love for you to have an opportunity to ask any questions, specific questions that you have. So let's see. The first one is, um, what responsibility do we have to go back and repair harms of the past? Provide GI Bill benefits to descendants, restore land taken by eminent domain, etc. It it feels like some people will always be ahead in terms of wealth unless we right the wrongs of the past. It's a great question.
Yeah, I like, well, I would say, for example, like I am a firm believer in reparations. Like, just given like you can't read history and understand the present without seeing the tremendous harm that policies, practices, and discrimination have done to Black Americans in this country. And then moving forward, that same logic of racism was then applied to other groups, and that has limited their opportunities. And those opportunities essentially are what allows communities to pass on wealth. So I would say, like, there are economists like Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton that have like tracked these types of policies. And like the Darities of the world will say, yes, you do need to have the repair. And like you cannot move forward as a country until you do that. I think there's the economic implication to that, but I think there's also another important element, which is that truth and reconciliation. I don't think we've had that formal process of actually saying on behalf of the federal government that, we did do these harms. We want to reconcile. Like, we have to be truthful. We then have to think of a way to move forward, but from the federal government. So I think that's a hugely important component to this too. I believe in those things. And then I would say that then the policy solutions to kind of like then move forward have been very different, but to me have been really interesting. So like, Derek Hamilton was the one that pushed forward baby bonds. So it's a way to say, okay, maybe we can't quite address the past by giving folks land or money or whatnot, but we can say for every generation moving forward, babies will have their own account that then can then move forward and build wealth that way. Now I think they're trying to use it and call them like Trump accounts. But those are, even the way that they're designed might actually exacerbate wealth inequities because they're not taking into account the various starting points of these different families. But the original idea and concept was a more affirmative way of building wealth, and that was baby bonds under Derek Hamilton's idea. You also see examples of like reparations in local governments. So places like Evanston have decided to experiment and say, like, okay, descendants of slaves that also were living in this part of the state will then get access to support for home ownership or whatnot. I mean, those to me are really interesting because I will say before things really move federally, they often first are due to experimentations that happen in state and local government. So I also think that's a place where state and local governments can think about how do we, move forward. But I would say, I do believe that repair is important. And when you think about wealth gaps, obviously there's the asset component and there's the debt components. You have to allow people to build wealth, and you also have to ensure that people are not going into debt or you're tackling the debt piece. But let's say, Black, Latino households' wealth is here, white households are here. If you just focus on like policies that are available to everybody, you're kind of always going to see the gap persist, even if assets are growing on both sides. You want to have policies that enable a convergence. And that convergence is the combination of shared prosperity where you actually do have to take from concentrated wealth and give to another community. But then you also have to enable a portfolio of policy solutions that go beyond, home ownership, but also investments and other aspects and enable people to like reach that convergence at some point. Sorry, that was a very like long answer.
No, it was so good because I think what's really I have a lot of my own thoughts, but that's not why people are here. Let me ask you another question. Nobody wants to hear my thoughts on economic viability. Okay. So, the next question is, can you speak more to the levers state governments can use to widen opportunity and the levers the Fed government is using to narrow?
So I will say there's actually a really interesting opportunity right now because there's a lot of governors that are interested in running for office. So I'd say like, a lot of them are trying to pass like bills to expand home ownership. I know there's a federal bill right now that's on hold, but like anything that allows more folks to build more homes and then purchase more homes, I think is like really important. But then you also see examples, I think it was like New Mexico and New York, they're trying to expand access to childcare. Like that alone would help people at least be able to continue to build their savings so that they're not putting the money all on childcare, but they're actually able to like grow their own nest egg elsewhere. Those types of policies are typically more viewed as like economic security, but I do think that that experimentation is very important to then enable us to say, okay, that will help save you some money. You can then build wealth elsewhere. Um, I think that there are also, like policies that enable like entrepreneurship. I think those could get stronger. I do think it's really interesting that it seems like you see some stuff at like local levels here and there, and they'll say, okay, we're going to cut red tape and help you, make it easier to start a business. I think that's always important, but that to me is like the bare minimum. I would actually like to see an affirmative vision for small businesses in America, one that acknowledges that the way in which people start businesses is very much based on their own economic situation to begin with. If a person has access to health insurance, they're more likely to start a business because they're not worried about that element of their life. And
Yeah.
right now, we're starting to see the rollback of a lot of like healthcare benefits, and that is impacting small businesses. And we don't usually associate the two. Um, if you have savings already, like that ends up being a lot of your initial like investment into your small business. And so what if we could help people, build up that initial like nest egg to then start their businesses? And so I would say like I am right now thinking about a way that we could do something federally, but a place I would test that out would actually be at the state level.
Yeah, and I will just add to home ownership also, I think there are ways to it would be great for states to incentivize actually creating the uh, public housing that that they have available. It's an area that we do a lot of work in, and I think it's not just right. It's not just getting folks into home ownership. It's also making sure that folks are not discriminated out of public and affordable housing.
Absolutely. And I would say too for Chicago, I know there's a very Chicago and Illinois group. Like the fact that we are having elections right now or about to have municipal elections, there's a governor's election. Like I always think of those as prime opportunities to put forth policy ideas or to push candidates towards certain objectives because yes, then you can get them on the record to say we are going to do this thing on housing or we are going to, and I know this is a nonprofit, so we're not trying to like push anyone one direction, but I think like thinking strategically about how do we get you to say this is a priority and how do we organize as a community because this is going to advance. And I think housing is a huge opportunity right now that you can actually support both at the municipal and state level.
Thank you. Okay, so another question. Um, what policy solutions can be created to prevent programs from being um, oh, well, I think there's sort of a series of questions here. Okay. Um, how can we frame messaging as taxpayers that we don't want our tax dollars allocated towards dismantling government dismantling the programs that government has typically supported? So maybe I think the question is like, right, federal IDA matching accounts for small businesses, housing that was eliminated in under the Trump 1 administration. I guess the question is how, right, you mentioned organizing. What
Mhm.
successful organizing have you seen, um, either against the actions of the federal government or elsewhere around economic policies? Or what messaging have you seen that's been effective to mobilize people?
That's hard because I mean, at the federal level in like most recent years, I'm trying to think. Oh, I mean, you could see things like right now, there are campaigns that I think have worked at state and local levels, like Fight for 15, to me is such a clear example of organizers staying on message and staying consistent. And that led to perhaps not at the federal level, but you see a lot of movement in state and local governments. And now, at least federally, we're trying to go beyond the 15. I think in Illinois, they're talking about 25. And like, I think that's important. And they you stay on message and you organize. And I will say a lot of that organizing came from directly impacted populations saying we need this for our livelihoods. Like I think that is a great example of like it took years, but that has at least led to steady movement at the state level. Now we're seeing like more push at the federal level. And I always try to look for those examples because more often than not, it has to start state and local for then federal lawmakers to buy in. Baby bonds has started at the state level. And I think that is super important. Those ideas catch on. And I would even say things like, when people talk about healthcare, universal healthcare, there's still a lot of skepticism. But I'm starting to see more conversations at the state level. And until a state passes it, like there's already like a bill in New York that's been around for a while. And I know there's some economists that are actually doing the math to show that it could be economically viable. Let's say that that does advance in New York, then you're likely to see other states pass those on. Childcare, universal childcare. Now we're starting to see experimentation in New York, New Mexico. And so I would say the positive examples start, the best ones start with directly lived experience, and then they start at the local and state level.
Thank you. Okay, Linda Tortolero says hello to you, and she also wants to know what organizations or government agencies do a good job of documenting and reporting economic indicators that better illustrate what working families and entrepreneurs may be feeling or experiencing. Like, and what are the indicators that they are collecting? So this goes back to something you were talking about.
Yeah,
What, yeah, is anybody actually using a different set of indicators?
I would say that right now people are experimenting, and I have not seen like a solid case for this is the one and we're all going to organize around it yet. But I do know that right now a lot of organizations are experimenting. And I would say the documentation then is happening more so on the qualitative side. So there are examples of like think tanks like Demos or maybe even I think it's like the worker centric organization, like Economic Policy Institute might be one of the closer ones. I think the Urban Institute is doing a really great job of highlighting what's happening at state and local levels. And I know at Brookings, our economic studies program right now is having a series of internal conversations to examine different economic indicators. But as of yet, I can't point you in one direction, but I am monitoring this. So I will follow up once I have the indicators.
And please follow, you can follow Tonantzin on LinkedIn. Uh, Maybe someone on our team can put some of her pieces in the chat. I know somebody had asked a question about that. And we'll wrap up with this last question because this is another area that we do work in, which is equitable education. And so one person asks, Tonantzin, can you talk about what types of reforms and access to education can help shift the wealth gap? Do you have a line of sight into that?
I actually think that Chicago might be an interesting model right now. We have programs like the Chicago Star Scholarship, and that concept was that any student with a B or a higher in a CPS school could then go to community college, city colleges for free.
Wow.
And I think, we don't talk about it in Chicago as free community college, but I'm like, that exists. And it is probably one of the cheaper ways to get your 4 years because you start with two free ones and then you can transfer. But if like we build up programs like that, that enables students to access the education, but I think more importantly, not accumulate so much debt.
Mm,
Because that is often something that Black and Latino communities experience disproportionately. We want them to get that education, but we need to make sure that they're doing it without accumulating so much debt. And so, more models to make community college or even four-year universities more affordable could really open up those avenues. So, I would concentrate there, and obviously, you want to make sure you still have the pre-K and early ed opportunities, expanding those programs. Then that also frees up childcare, so that could be one avenue. And then the in between is making sure that the K through 8, K through 12 people, that they're actually not being left behind, that they're actually having the opportunities and the resources to then be able to advance into those 2 and 4 year college opportunities. But
yeah,
I
I
think the
really,
wealth piece and like the debt, that's the biggest crusher for people.
yeah, it's really, I have not thought about the debt piece so along with wealth creation. And as you're explaining it, it's so obvious that there has to be policies that allow for one and dampen the other.
Yes, because that's what wealth is. It's what you own minus what you owe, assets minus debt.
Yeah. Um, I think this is our uh kind of time. We have a couple of minutes. I just want to say thank you so much. It's so lovely to be able to talk to a friend. And thank you so much for your work. Oh, look, there's lots of Tonantzin articles, I think. Maybe not. Oh, no, that's Kate just putting in what you can do to get involved with CLC. But Tonantzin, I love that you are out there dreaming and documenting and providing a roadmap from where we are right now, which is not where we want to be, um, with respect to communities of color and Americans generally. I think you talk about Latino entrepreneurs as the bellwether. Lonnie Guinier, who I took a class from, often talked about how our most vulnerable communities are canaries in the coal mine. And I
Absolutely.
think we are coming we are seeing that play out, which is that what happens to our most vulnerable ultimately makes us all vulnerable. Um, and if one question, my last question for you is like, what would have to be true in 5 years for you to look back on what is a very dark and strange time and say it was the best thing that happened to us?
Oh, I mean, I would say that it would be more people getting involved in both the civil rights and economic justice fight. I like we can't do it alone. It has to be more people, everyone, in fact, but more people getting involved to expanding. Because it is the double fight, and then they're interconnected,
Yeah.
and we can't advance without the economic justice. We can't advance without civil rights, and so getting more people involved and organizing and showing up for their neighbors. And I know that sounds so simple, but like if in 5 years, 10 years, that's what it looks like, I think we would get much further than where we are right now.
Yeah. What I hear you saying in that is that if we come out of this with greater solidarity for like a collective
Yes.
good, um,
Said it better than I love it.
no, no, um, uh, then we will have made some meaning out of our collective suffering.
Absolutely.
Tansin, thank you so, so much, love. It's so good to be with you. I can't wait to spend some time with you in person. Thank you for all you're doing.
Likewise. So good to see you. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah. Bye, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Our next conversation is with Professor Cummings out of UCLA. I think we're going to be talking about lawyers and responsibility. Thank you, Tanatsi.